So first thing I want to do is I'm going to improve the security of this program by not storing the credentials in the file itself. So if I check this into GitHub in a repository and somebody got access to the repository, they would see my MongoDB username and password, and they could use it to connect to the database and basically do whatever they want. So I want to get this thing and this thing out of this file and ideally put it somewhere outside of my project folder. Now, there are two fairly standard locations for putting stuff like that, depending on what platform you're on. So if you're on Windows, it usually goes in app data roaming. And if you're in Linux or Mac, it usually goes in home. And home for the user that has permission to run this thing. So let me show you really quickly how you can get access to those values. So in Python, there's a package called OS, which is bundled with Python. So import OS, and then there's a pseudo dictionary called environ that you can access by going os.environ. And if you actually parse this out, you see that it's a bunch of key value pairs. So there's all user profile, colon, and then a long string value, and then chocolatey install and a long string value, and so on. And you can do like for key in os.environ. Print key. So, whoops. Yeah, I misspelled environ. Environ. So these are all the keys that are currently on my system. And the ones that I'm interested in Windows is this app data thing. And the value of this thing is going to be a string, which is the path to the app data folder. If you're on Linux or Mac, you would see a variable called home. I don't have one because I'm on Windows, but home would be the path to your user folder, which is in /users/your username. And then on Windows, inside of app data roaming, so let's look up the value of that. So the value of that is going to be os.environ square bracket app data. And it's C users mark G app data roaming. And then if you go there, so C users mark G app data roaming. I wanted app data roaming. So you see a bunch of separate application folders. And then inside some of these application folders are various things like subfolders and files, log files, configuration settings. So like this bioshock.ini and user.ini are saving settings for Bioshock and so on. So this is a typical place to store configuration information for an application. And it's what I'm going to use. So what I'm going to do is under this roaming folder, I'm going to create a folder for my show browser. You'll do for password manager. And then inside of that folder, I'm going to have a file called showbrowser.ini that holds my configuration settings. And then, so this is a standard Windows thing, but it also works on Linux and Mac if you use the right library, which I'm going to show you. So if I open this with Notepad, this is the standard format. Basically, you have a section at the top, square bracket name, square bracket, and this is a set of related variable values. And then, let me scroll down a little bit. So for example, under fast track, there's a proxy URL setting, server SOAP, client URL, and a bunch of stuff. And this is what we're going to do to save our database username and database password. So we'll have a section called database and a username value and a password value. And this is just a text file. So I'm going to create it inside, create it as a text file right here. So roaming, right click, new folder called show browser. And inside of show browser, you don't need to get fancy. You can write this, you can do this in code by writing a Python procedure, but you can also just type it in. So show browser.ini. And then I'm going to edit this in Notepad++, and we'll have a section for database. And then, so username is going to be equal to this thing here. And password is going to be equal to this thing here, up to the @ sign. Now, you could also put your cluster name. We'll call that host name. And I think probably the rest of it's okay. I could, if I wanted to parameterize and treat it as a configuration setting for the database name, collection names, any of that, I could also make those be INI settings, but this is enough for now. Okay, so is this more secure? Well, it's certainly more secure than having it in the source code where potentially anybody could see it. This file here is in my personal app data folder, and so only so system administrators have access to pretty much everything on the system in Windows, and there's really no way around that. But if somebody has systems administration access to your machine, then they probably can touch pretty much anything that they want to touch, and the game's lost at that point. So any security is only as strong as the weakest link. And if you have a system that's running old patch levels of operating system code that has known exploits, and people can get on and elevate their privileges and get sysadmin access, then it doesn't matter how careful you are with anything else, because they're going to get access to everything. They can get your source code, they can step through your source code, they can modify your program, they can add print statements anywhere where credentials are available. If the system's compromised, they have access. So the best we can do is make a safe system, and then this is no less safe than any other personal file I have. So if you have a file with your bank records, you have your login information and a Google account that can, connect to once you're logged into your account, all of that stuff is up for grabs, and this is too. But that said, it's safer than just putting it in the code. So I have a configuration file. I'm going to use a library called config parser in order to read this. So let me exit for a second, and I'm going to do pip install config parser. Actually, I think it's all lowercase. Yeah, and then I'm going to run Python, and the way you import this is from config parser, lowercase, you import a class called config parser. Okay, so config parser is a class, and you make a config object by calling this constructor. So I'm going to make a config parser object by making a new config parser. And then config parser object has methods like read, and you can give it a path like os.environ, which I have to import os, sorry, import os. And then I can say config parser read os.environ, sub app data, and then plus slash, and then whatever my application name is, which I would put in a constant, but right now it's going to be show browser slash show browser dot ini. And if I've done everything right, I didn't get an error. So if I type config parser, I can say sections, and that's a method, so I have to call it. So there's one section. If there had been more sections, they would be separate things here. And then you can also say config parser subsections and then reference the database section. And actually, hang on. Maybe it's just config parser square bracket database. Yeah. So this is a collection, and you can say convert it to a list, I think. Actually, hold on. For key in config parser database, so I'm going to print key and also config parser database and then key. And I forgot my closing parenthesis. Okay, so what that did was it pulled up the config parser section for database, which is basically, this is a nested dictionary. It's a wrapper around it, but basically this is the key in a dictionary and the value is another dictionary. And so the other dictionary, the keys are these property names and the values are whatever was in my init file. Okay, so what I'm going to do here for simplicity is I'm going to read the database section inside my connect method the first time I connect to the database. So right here. So I'm going to go ahead and import OS and from config parser import config parser. And then let's also define a class property called app name, which is going to be minus show browser. Okay, so then here, let's go ahead and say config equals config parser, and then config.read os environ. So actually what I want to do here is I want to say if app data in os.environ, then config.read os.environ app data plus slash, I should do a formatted string. Nah, okay. Plus slash plus class dot app name plus slash plus class dot app name plus dot ini. And that might have been better if I had actually used a formatted string, but okay. So that's on Windows. L if home and os.environ. We're going to do the same thing. And then I have to actually remember come on. Yeah. Okay, so this is mostly what it looks like on Windows, and I'm sorry, on Linux. So basically, it's going to look like os.environ home, and then plus slash plus app name plus slash plus, that's the same. Okay, so that's going to handle reading it. And then I could actually put this in a separate function, but yeah, whatever. Okay, so now that I have that, I want to get username is config sub database username, and password is config database password, and cluster is config database hostname. I guess I'll call it hostname. And then here, this string now becomes a formatted string with slash slash username colon password at hostname. So if I've done everything right, it should work exactly the same. Okay, so that's good. All right, seems to work. So advantage is anybody who gets this file isn't going to know anything about my credentials for accessing the database.